I had not even recovered from my emergency heart surgery when my husband tossed divorce papers onto my hospital bed. He looked down at me and said, "You and that defective baby are just a dead weight to my future." Then he flew to Singapore with his mistress. 9 years later, he showed up at my office demanding to meet his son. But when he learned exactly who my son was and what he legally owned, the color drained from his face and his knees hit the floor. I am Victoria, 32 years old, and my life changed forever in a sterile hospital room in Chicago. Before I share how I turned the worst day of my life into an empire, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its debts. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Chicago Medical Center recovery room hummed with a low, irritating frequency. I was staring blankly at the ceiling tiles, while the fresh sutures in my chest burned with a hot, searing agony. Down the hall in the neonatal cardiac intensive care unit, my son Ethan, born with a severe congenital heart defect, was fighting for his life inside a maze of plastic tubing. The rhythmic mechanical beep of his heart monitor was the only sound keeping me anchored to reality. I was terrified, exhausted, and desperately waiting for my husband to walk through the door and tell me everything was going to be fine. We had planned for this child, prayed for him, and now that he was here vulnerable and requiring multiple surgeries, I needed my partner more than ever. When the door to my room finally pushed open, it was not a friendly nurse checking my vitals. It was not a compassionate doctor with a reassuring update on Ethan and his repairing heart valves. It was Julian, my husband of 3 years. He did not look like a man who had just become a father, or a man whose wife had nearly flatlined on the operating table just hours earlier. Instead, he was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, holding a sleek leather briefcase, and checking his expensive watch with an air of profound impatience. The smell of his cologne filled the small room, masking the sharp scent of antiseptic. He did not walk to my bedside to hold my hand. He did not ask how I was managing the blinding physical pain. He did not ask if our tiny son was breathing on his own. He simply stopped at the foot of my bed, unlatched his briefcase with a loud click, and pulled out a thick manila envelope. With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed it onto my lap. It landed softly against the thin hospital blanket, but the weight of it felt like a heavy anvil crushing my chest. "You and that baby are just a dead weight to me," Julian said. His voice was flat, completely devoid of emotion, like he was canceling a subscription rather than destroying a family. I stared at the envelope, my brain rendered sluggish by the heavy doses of pain medication and the sheer absurdity of the moment. "What is this?" I rasped, my throat dry and aching. "Divorce papers," he stated, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the small mirror on the wall. I did not sign up for a life of suffocating medical debt, pediatric cardiologists, and a wife who cries all the time. Chloe and I are leaving for Singapore tonight. I secured a highly paid senior executive contract there. I suggest you sign those quickly so we do not have to drag this messy situation out in family court. "Singapore," I whispered, struggling to push myself up on my elbows. The monitors attached to my chest fluttered wildly as my heart rate spiked. "Julian, Ethan is in the intensive care unit right now. We have a mountain of medical debt piling up by the hour. You cannot just leave us here alone to deal with this." "Watch me," he sneered, turning his back toward the door. "Oh, and Victoria, do not bother trying to access the joint checking account. I am going to need startup capital for my new life." He walked out the heavy wooden door, clicking shut behind him, leaving me in a deafening, suffocating silence. The cruelty was so precise, so incredibly calculated that for a full minute I could not even process how to inhale. He had abandoned his critically ill son and his recovering wife without a single ounce of hesitation or remorse. I fumbled for my phone on the bedside table, ignoring the sharp, stabbing pain radiating through my core with every frantic movement. My fingers shook violently as I logged into our banking application. The screen loaded slowly before the numbers finally appeared on the glaring white display. Available balance $12.50. He had drained it completely. $52,000 was gone. Every cent we had saved for a house down payment. Every dollar from our emergency fund we diligently built together. While I was under anesthesia, He had transferred it all to an offshore account in Southeast Asia. He had not just abandoned us. He had financially assassinated us to fund his luxurious new life with his mistress. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone against the blank hospital wall. A strange glacial calm washed over me. It was the raw survival instinct kicking in, burying the immense grief and replacing it with pure focus. I was broke, physically broken, and drowning in medical debt. But as I stared at the $12 to my name, a fierce fire ignited. Julian had left me absolutely nothing to lose. An hour later, the heavy door to my hospital room pushed open again. I braced myself, half expecting Julian to return with another blow. But the tension in my chest unraveled when I saw my older sister Maya and her husband Marcus. Marcus was a senior partner at a top-tier corporate law firm in downtown Chicago. A man with a brilliant, calculating mind. Marcus was not the type to offer hollow platitudes or useless sympathy. He was a shark in a bespoke suit, a man who saw the world purely in terms of leverage liabilities and legal checkmates. When he saw my pale face, the tears I had refused to shed, and the divorce papers lying discarded on my lap, he did not offer a pitying hug. He pulled up a sterile vinyl hospital chair, opened his briefcase, and went straight to work. "Talk to me, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice, a steady, grounding baritone that cut right through the sterile panic of the hospital room. I handed him my phone, the banking application still open to the devastating balance. He drained the joint account. He left divorce papers right before he walked out. He said he is flying to Singapore tonight with Chloe to start a new senior executive contract. Maya covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror as she looked from the phone to my bandaged chest. "Oh my God, Victoria. Ethan needs round-the-clock care. The medical bills alone will bankrupt you." "Forget the bills for a second," Marcus interrupted, his eyes narrowing as he scrutinized the transaction history on my phone screen. He tapped the glass a few times, his legal mind connecting the dots with ruthless efficiency. "Victoria, did he transfer this money directly to a bank account in Singapore?" "Yes," I breathed, clutching the edges of my hospital gown. "He specifically said he needed it for startup capital for his new life." A slow, dangerous smile spread across Marcus' face. It was the look of an apex predator spotting Zorings. It was the look of an apex predator spotting a fatal, glaring weakness in its prey. "Julian is an arrogant fool," Marcus said, setting the phone down on my bedside table. "He thinks because it was a joint account he had the legal right to simply empty it. But he just crossed state and international lines with misappropriated marital funds intended for medical care. He effectively hid shared assets in direct anticipation of a divorce filing." "What exactly does that mean for us?" I asked, wincing, as another sharp wave of pain radiated from my surgical incision. "It means," Marcus said, leaning forward and folding his hands, "that technically I can have federal authorities look into this as wire fraud. More importantly, Singapore has incredibly strict moral and financial codes for expatriate work visas. If a prospective expat is flagged for pending financial fraud investigations, or if his assets are temporarily frozen by an American family court injunction, his precious work visa is dead on arrival. He will be stopped at customs, detained, deported, and lose his lucrative contract before he even unpacks his bags." "Do it!" Maya hissed fiercely, pacing at the foot of my bed. "Call the police right now. Have him arrested at O'Hare Airport in front of his mistress." "No," I said, my voice shockingly clear and steady. Both of them stopped and looked at me. The heavy pain medication was wearing off, leaving me entirely lucid and hyper-aware of my reality. I looked down at the divorce papers resting on my legs. Julian wanted to be entirely free of us. He had literally called my vulnerable son a dead weight. If I dragged him through court for the money, I would be legally tied to him for years. We would have to share custody. He would be forced to remain in Ethan's life, acting as a toxic, resentful ghost, haunting our every single milestone. "I do not want the money," I said, looking directly into Marcus' eyes. "I want him gone permanently." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, evaluating the cold steel in my gaze. He understood exactly what I was asking for. He did not coddle me or tell me to sleep on it. He recognized that I was making the very first executive decision of my new life. "You want a voluntary termination of parental rights," Marcus stated, nodding slowly as the strategy formed in his head. "You want him to sign away every single legal claim right and financial obligation to Ethan. Can you make him sign it before he boards that plane?" I asked. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out his laptop, flipping it open on his lap. "Julian flight is at 10 tonight. It is currently 4 in the afternoon. He is currently panicked about securing his new life and protecting his stolen cash. I am going to draft a binding legal contract right now, in exchange for you signing a waiver releasing him from all future alimony and child support claims and a non-disclosure agreement preventing us from reporting the transfer to the authorities or his new employer. He will sign a complete, irrevocable termination of his parental rights." "Will a judge actually uphold that?" Maya asked, nervously wringing her hands. "Usually courts do not let fathers just sign away their rights to avoid paying child support. They do when the mother agrees to assume total financial responsibility and when we attach a sworn affidavit detailing his explicit refusal to care for a medically fragile infant," Marcus replied, his fingers flying rapidly across his keyboard. "Julian is a coward. He wants a clean, quiet break with his mistress. When I explain that the alternative is an immediate court injunction freezing his passport and alerting Singapore immigration to his financial fraud, he will sign it faster than he can breathe." For the next 2 hours, my sterile hospital room transformed into a tactical war room. The rhythmic beeping of Ethan monitor down the hall became my driving metronome. I signed the divorce petition modifications. I signed the comprehensive financial waivers. I legally absorbed hundreds of thousands of dollars in impending medical debt without a second thought. I was technically signing away my financial ruin, but I knew I was purchasing my son absolute freedom from a man who despised his very existence. At 6:30 in the evening, Marcus hit send on a highly encrypted email directed to Julian's phone. We waited in a suffocating, heavy silence. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I pictured Julian sitting comfortably in the first-class lounge at the airport, sipping an expensive cocktail with Chloe, abruptly opening the email from a top-tier corporate lawyer. I imagined the color violently draining from his face as he read Marcus' flawless, ironclad legal threats. I imagined the terrifying realization dawning on him that his perfect escape route was completely surrounded by legal landmines. He thought he had outsmarted a vulnerable woman, but he had walked blindly into a trap set by a man who destroyed corporate executives for a living. The clock ticked closer to his boarding time, each passing second solidifying my newfound resolve. I was no longer a victim waiting for rescue. I was a mother, securing her child's future. At exactly 7:15 in the evening, the sharp ping of an incoming email shattered the heavy silence in my hospital room. My breath hitched in my chest, but Marcus did not flinch. He calmly placed his hand on his mousepad and clicked open the message. The sterile white glow of the laptop screen illuminated his face as his eyes scanned the attached documents. I watched his expression, searching for any sign of a counteroffer or a refusal. Instead, a deep, satisfied exhale escaped his lips. "He signed it," Marcus stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Every single page." Marcus opened the files one by one, verifying the digital signatures and the timestamp. Julian had executed the voluntary termination of parental rights, the non-disclosure agreement, and the financial waivers. He had surrendered all legal claims to my son to protect his stolen cash and his precious overseas visa. Attached to the legal documents was a short, bitter message typed directly into the email body. "Deal," Julian wrote. "Keep the dead weight. Do not ever contact me again." Marcus reached into his sleek leather briefcase and extracted a compact portable printer. He connected it to his laptop, and the soft hum of the machine processing the files felt like the sound of a closing vault. He printed the termination agreement, the ink still warm as he handed the pages to me. "He is legally a ghost," Marcus said, gently but firmly. "He has no son. You have sole legal and physical custody forever. If he ever tries to step foot in this country and claim otherwise, this document destroys him." I held the warm paper in my trembling hands. A single tear escaped my eye, and dropped onto the black ink, smudging Julian's signature. But it was not a tear of sorrow or heartbreak. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated victory. I was 20-something flat broke, bleeding from a major surgery and staring down the barrel of astronomical medical debt. Yet I had just won the only war that mattered. I had purchased my child absolute freedom from a man who viewed his existence as a liability. Maya sat on the edge of my bed and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. "You did it," she whispered fiercely. "You protected him. We are going to get through the rest of this together." I looked at the legal document one last time before handing it back to Marcus for safekeeping. The victim who had cried over a $12 bank balance was gone. In her place, a new hardened version of myself was rapidly taking shape. I wiped my face and sat up a little straighter, ignoring the sharp pull of my surgical incisions. There was no more room for panic. Panic was an emotion for people who had the luxury of falling apart. I had to build an empire from absolute scratch. The stark reality of my new life crashed into me the moment I was discharged from the hospital days later. Walking out through the sliding glass doors with an empty car seat, while Ethan remained behind in the cardiac intensive care unit, was a unique kind of torture. I did not return to the comfortable suburban apartment Julian and I had shared. I could not afford the rent, and I refused to be surrounded by the ghosts of a dead marriage. Instead, I moved into a tiny, cramped studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of Chicago. I could only secure the lease because Marcus and Maya quietly covered the first and last month's rent. The apartment smelled faintly of old paint, and the heating radiator clanked loudly throughout the night. It was a severe downgrade from my previous life, but it was mine. It was the absolute bottom, which meant the only possible direction was up. I did not have the time or the energy to mourn my marriage. Grief is a luxury reserved for those who have a safety net. I had an infant fighting for every breath inside a hospital incubator, and a staggering $130,000 in medical debt bearing down on me. The billing department at the hospital had already started sending the initial invoices, thick envelopes that I stacked neatly on my small kitchen counter. I did not hide from them. I opened every single one. I memorized the numbers. They became my fuel. Every morning at 4 a.m, long before the sun rose over the Chicago skyline, I boarded 2 different city buses to reach the medical center. I would scrub my hands, put on a sterile yellow gown, and sit by Ethan's plastic enclosure. I would slip my hands through the round portholes to touch his fragile skin. He was so small, surrounded by wires, but his chest rose and fell with a stubborn, fierce rhythm. He was a fighter. I whispered to him about the world outside. I told him about the tiny apartment. I told him about his Uncle Marcus and Aunt Maya. Most importantly, I made him a promise. I swore to him that no matter what it took, no matter how many hours I had to work or how many obstacles I had to crush, I would build an impenetrable fortress around him. I promised him that he would never feel the sting of poverty, and he would never know the cruelty of the man who walked away. By 8 a.m, I would leave the hospital and head straight to my desk at the regional energy software firm where I worked as a mid-level data analyst. Before the divorce, I had been content with my salary and predictable hours. But mid-level pay would not clear massive debt or build the fortress I had promised my son. I needed massive leverage. I needed to become entirely indispensable to the executives who ran the company. I stopped chatting with coworkers in the break room. I stopped taking lunch hours. I channeled every ounce of my anger, my fear, and my betrayal into raw, aggressive productivity. I began dissecting the logistics of managing renewable energy grids, power distribution networks, and structural load balancing for the city infrastructure. I looked at the code not as mundane tasks, but as a puzzle I could exploit. I was ready to go to war with the corporate world, and I would not stop until I conquered it. When Ethan was finally cleared to leave the intensive care unit, the reality of my new existence hit with the force of a freight train. He came home attached to specialized monitoring equipment that became the permanent soundtrack of our lives. My tiny studio apartment was transformed into a makeshift medical bay. I had exactly 1 armchair, a secondhand crib, and a folding table where I set up my laptop. There was no nursery painted in pastel colors. There were no baby showers or congratulatory balloons. There was only the terrifying responsibility of keeping a fragile human alive completely on my own. My days became a brutal, calculated marathon of pure survival. I slept in short intervals, jolting awake every time Ethan monitors beeped. By 5 in the morning, I was already logged into the corporate server, reviewing overnight grid data and cross-referencing structural loads before my supervisors even had their first cup of coffee. I bathed Ethan, administered his medications, and secured his monitors. Then, I carried him and his heavy equipment down 3 flights of stairs because the building elevator was chronically broken. I dropped him off at a specialized medical daycare facility across town, a place that consumed a massive portion of my paycheck before catching the commuter train to the corporate office. I worked grueling hours without a single complaint. I did not take sick days. I did not take lunch breaks. While my colleagues gathered to gossip, I remained glued to my dual monitors. I was not there to make friends. I was there to find the structural weaknesses in the regional power distribution network. The company I worked for managed smart grid technology for the entire Midwest. It was a lucrative operation, but underneath the polished corporate facade, it was bleeding efficiency. The routing systems for energy loads were archaic. The executives at the top were completely blind to the logistical hemorrhaging happening at the data level. They saw spreadsheets full of acceptable losses. I saw an opportunity to make myself undeniably vital. Every night after picking Ethan up and enduring the transit back to our cramped apartment, my real shift began. I would sit on the worn carpet rocking my fragile son with my left arm while my right hand flew across the laptop keyboard. I taught myself advanced artificial intelligence algorithms and predictive load balancing models. I mapped out the entire Midwest energy network on a cheap whiteboard. I tracked the seasonal usage spikes and the precise infrastructure demands of every major sector in our district. I was coding a proprietary AI algorithm, a dynamic energy distribution model designed to predict grid failures before they happened. The physical toll was staggering. My clothes hung loosely on my frame because I frequently skipped dinners to afford the exorbitant copays for Ethan's specialized cardiac appointments. My hands were perpetually shaking from extreme sleep deprivation and black coffee. But every time the exhaustion threatened to pull me under, I would look at the legal document Marcus had printed in the hospital room. I kept Julian's signed termination of parental rights framed on my desk. It was not a trophy. It was a daily reminder of the abyss I was climbing out of. Every time my vision blurred from staring at lines of code, I remembered Julian adjusting his silk tie and calling my son dead weight. That memory was pure high-octane fuel. It burned away the fatigue and left only a cold, sharp ambition. For 8 months, I gathered my data in absolute silence. I did not pitch my ideas to my immediate supervisor, a lazy middle manager who would have undoubtedly stolen my work. I bypassed the entire middle management structure completely. I waited for the perfect, undeniable moment to strike. That moment arrived in the middle of a brutal summer heat wave that paralyzed the entire Chicago metropolitan area. The extreme temperatures threatened rolling blackouts, and the regional grid was failing. The company dispatch center was in a state of blind panic. Major hospitals and commercial centers were running dangerously close to complete power loss. The standard distribution routes were overloaded, and the executives were scrambling, bracing for a public relations disaster. I stood up from my cubicle, grabbed my laptop, and walked directly into the glass-walled office of the chief executive officer. I did not knock. I did not ask for permission. I bypassed his protesting secretary and placed my laptop squarely on his mahogany desk. I did not apologize for the interruption. I looked the executive directly in the eyes and told him I had a rerouting AI protocol that utilized secondary municipal substations and a staggered load transfer system that could stabilize the grid in under 20 minutes. The CEO stared at me, his face pale and tight with stress. He looked at my laptop screen, then back at my face, searching for a trace of hesitation. There was none. He picked up his desk phone, dialed the main control floor, and ordered them to follow my exact algorithmic instructions. I took over his keyboard. I directed the energy loads, bypassing the failing sectors and utilizing routes I had cross-referenced with municipal data. The distribution network stabilized with absolute precision. 12 minutes later, the system confirmed the grid was secured. The city crisis was averted, and the company was hailed as a savior on the local evening news. The next morning, the CEO called me back into his office. He slid a single piece of paper across the mahogany desk, offering me a promotion to senior analyst and a modest bonus. I did not even look at the paper. I slid it right back to him. I opened my briefcase, pulled out a thick binder containing my 8 months of predictive modeling, and dropped it onto his desk with a heavy, deliberate thud. I told him the bonus was a profound insult. I pointed to the data showing how my algorithm could cut his operational bleeding by a massive margin, saving the company upwards of $15 million annually. I demanded the title of Vice President of Infrastructure and a base salary that matched the raw value I was bringing to the table. He balked at first, citing my lack of executive experience. I simply picked up my binder and told him I would take my algorithm directly to his biggest competitor by noon. He caved immediately. I walked out of that office as vice president. For the next 2 years, I overhauled their entire distribution network. I fired incompetent managers, renegotiated massive contracts, and implemented my dynamic AI model. The board of directors praised the CEO for his visionary leadership, rewarding him with massive stock options. I sat in quiet board meetings watching mediocre men pat themselves on the back for the grueling, sleepless work I had executed from the floor of my cramped studio apartment. That was the exact moment my ambition permanently evolved. I refused to spend the rest of my life building lucrative empires for men who did not know how to write a single line of code. I was going to build my own. I called Marcus on a Friday evening and told him my plan. We met at his high-rise office downtown, and I laid out the architecture for my own independent firm. I needed to legally structure a corporation draft, airtight non-compete workarounds, and secure a massive commercial business loan. Marcus was ruthless in his execution. He shielded my intellectual property and set up the corporate framework for what would quickly become Zenith Dynamics. Securing the initial loan was the ultimate test of my resolve. I sat across from commercial banking executives presenting my flawless track record of saving millions in energy logistics. They saw my numbers, my highly aggressive growth projections, and the sheer unyielding confidence in my execution. The bank approved a multi-million-dollar line of credit without asking for a second meeting. The early days of Zenith Dynamics were brutal and entirely unforgiving. I leased a server space on the industrial outskirts of the city. I aggressively poached the best engineers from my former employer. I operated on a zero margin for error. My first major independent breakthrough came exactly 7 months after launching Zenith. The largest municipal grid in the state was deeply dissatisfied with their current vendor. I secured a pitch with their chief procurement officer. I brought an interactive model that tracked their historical failure data. I proved that Zenith could actively anticipate their grid shortages. I guaranteed a zero-fail protocol backing it up with strict financial penalties. I walked out with an exclusive multi-million-dollar contract. That contract was the absolute catalyst. Regional networks and wealthy commercial centers rushed to sign exclusive contracts with Zenith Dynamics. I targeted the exact supply chain routes my former employer had foolishly neglected. I reinvested every single dollar of profit back into Zenith infrastructure. We became known not just as a vendor, but as a critical extension of the city infrastructure. As the company exploded in financial value, my personal reality shifted dramatically. The tiny studio apartment became a distant, fading memory. I bought a sprawling, highly secure home in a pristine neighborhood. More importantly, the suffocating medical debt was eradicated completely. Ethan was no longer reliant on underfunded hospital programs. I hired the absolute best private pediatric cardiologists in the country. We transitioned him out of constant monitoring. He grew stronger, faster, and brighter every single day. The fragile infant who had fought for breath was transforming into a vibrant, brilliant child. I had kept the promise I made to him in that dark hospital room. I had built an impenetrable fortress, and I financed it entirely with the blood, sweat, and undeniable brilliance of my own hard work. Fast forward to the present day. I am 34 years old, and the frantic, desperate survival mode of my 20s has been entirely replaced by a calculated, cold precision. I am sitting behind a custom-made desk in my corner office, looking out through floor-to-ceiling glass windows at the freezing gray expanse of the Chicago skyline. I am wearing a tailored suit, reviewing the quarterly earnings reports for Zenith Dynamics. The numbers on the screen do not induce panic anymore. They represent absolute dominance. My company is currently valued at $85 million. We operate a massive network of smart grid technology across multiple states, managing the critical energy supply for countless major hubs. I employ hundreds of engineers and analysts. I dictate the market terms. Yet, despite sitting on top of a multi-million-dollar empire, I do not live a flashy, ostentatious lifestyle. I still drive a highly reliable, heavily armored domestic SUV. My home is a beautiful but discreet property, secured behind heavy iron gates and state-of-the-art surveillance systems in a quiet suburb. I live with this extreme level of discretion because my memory is flawlessly sharp. I vividly remember staring at a bank balance of $12 while my surgical incision bled through my hospital gown. I remember the absolute terror of sudden crushing financial ruin. Because of that profound trauma, I made a strategic, aggressive decision early on to protect my assets from any unforeseen liabilities, predatory lawsuits, or ghosts from my past. 2 years ago, I brought my brother-in-law Marcus into my corner office. I slid a massive, heavily indexed portfolio across my desk, containing the complete financial architecture of my entire life. Every corporate share of Zenith Dynamics, every piece of commercial real estate I had acquired, the offshore investment portfolios, and the aggressive venture capital stakes. I want everything locked down, I told Marcus, looking at him with absolute seriousness. I want a financial fortress so deep and so legally complex that no creditor, no lawsuit, and no individual could ever pierce the corporate veil. Marcus smiled, leaning back in the leather guest chair, his brilliant legal mind already assembling the necessary corporate architecture. As a top-tier corporate lawyer, he specialized in asset protection for ultra-high net worth individuals. "We are going to build a ghost entity," Marcus explained, tapping his gold pen against the desk. "An impenetrable corporate shell that legally absorbs your wealth effectively, making you a high-earning employee on paper while shielding the actual millions from any personal liability." Within 3 weeks, Marcus established a completely insulated, irrevocable blind trust. We officially named the corporate entity EM Capital. On paper and in the public eye, EM Capital was an aggressive, faceless corporate entity, registered to take advantage of strict corporate privacy laws. It quietly bought up commercial debt-managed prime real estate, invested heavily in secure municipal bonds, and held the vast majority of voting shares in several tech firms, including Zenith. It filed massive corporate tax returns and operated through a sophisticated network of shell companies and legal proxies. It was a financial titan operating entirely in the shadows. In reality, EM simply stood for Ethan and Marcus. Marcus was appointed as the sole legal executive and trustee of the holding company. He maintained absolute fiduciary control over the trust-aggressive investment strategies and the sole exclusive beneficiary of every single asset, every piece of real estate, every collected commercial debt package, and every penny of that $85 million empire was my 9-year-old son, Ethan. Legally speaking, I own nothing but a modest, highly taxed salary. As the chief executive officer of Zenith Dynamics, I did not own the commercial servers. I did not own the software patents. EM Capital owned them. If anyone ever tried to sue me personally, or if some distant phantom from my past ever tried to claim a percentage of my net worth, they would hit a solid brick wall. They would find a hard-working corporate executive with a nice salary, but the millions belonged entirely to a ghost entity. Ethan was completely shielded both financially and physically. The fragile infant who had desperately fought for breath was now a thriving, energetic, and brilliant 9-year-old boy. He was an artificial intelligence prodigy, completely obsessed with complex algorithms, architectural blueprints, and computer coding. He attended an exclusive private robotics academy, and spent his weekends building intricate motorized drone models on the floor of our living room, completely unaware of the massive corporate holding company operating exclusively in his name. Ethan had my dark eyes and my stubborn determination, but he possessed absolutely none of Julian's arrogant, dismissive cruelty. He was an incredibly kind, empathetic child. Maya and Marcus were a constant loving presence in his life, filling the home with laughter, stability, and the fierce protection of a true chosen family. My life was a perfectly calibrated, flawlessly maintained machine. I had won the war. I possessed absolute peace, unshakable wealth, and a brilliant son I adored more than life itself. The severe trauma of my 20s, the betrayal in the hospital room, and the suffocating medical debt were all permanently buried in the ashes of a completely different lifetime. The man who had caused that pain was nothing but a faded, legally severed memory. I was secure. I was untouchable until my desk phone vibrated sharply against the wood on a rainy Tuesday morning, threatening to shatter the fortress I had spent 9 grueling years building. I reached across the desk and pressed the blinking intercom button. "Yes, Samantha," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Miss Victoria, my executive assistant, said, her voice laced with an unusual tone of panic and confusion. "There is a man in the main lobby demanding to see you. He does not have an appointment. He is making quite a scene with the front desk security. He says he is your husband." The silver pen in my hand stopped moving. The ambient noise of the city wind against the glass suddenly felt deafening. A cold, forgotten phantom had just stepped directly out of an unmarked grave. "Send building security," I instructed flatly. "I do not have a husband." "I am trying, ma'am," Samantha whispered urgently. "But he is yelling that he has a legal right to see his son. He is threatening to call the local press if you do not come down. He keeps shouting your maiden name." A dark, dangerous anger flared in my chest, replacing the initial shock with pure, calculated ice. Julian had returned. He was standing in the lobby of my $85 million tech empire, attempting to use the son he had discarded as leverage for a public spectacle. He wanted a scene. I would not give him one. "Tell security to escort him to Conference Room B. On the 4th floor," I commanded. "Do not let him near the executive suites. Confiscate his phone at the door. I will be down in exactly 5 minutes." I released the intercom button and stood up. I did not rush. I took a moment to smooth the lapels of my tailored charcoal suit. I checked my reflection in the dark glass of the window. There was no trace of the bleeding, terrified 20-something girl he had left in that hospital room. I was a corporate titan. I owned the building he was currently standing in. I walked out of my office projecting absolute authority with every step I took down the carpeted hallway. When I opened the heavy glass door of Conference Room B, 2 broad-shouldered security guards were standing silently against the back wall. Sitting at the long mahogany table was a man I barely recognized. The arrogant, polished executive who had tossed divorce papers onto my hospital bed was entirely gone. The 35-year-old Julian sitting in front of me looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. The expensive tailored suit had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray jacket that frayed at the cuffs. The gleaming luxury watch was missing from his wrist. His face was deeply lined, his skin carried an unhealthy grayish pallor, and his posture screamed of profound defeat. "Victoria!" Julian gasped, jumping out of his chair the moment I entered. His eyes darted around the luxurious conference room, taking in the expensive digital displays and the sleek modern architecture. "My God, look at you. Look at this place. You own this company. Sit down, Julian," I ordered. My voice was a whip cracking through the air. He flinched heavily, dropping back into the leather chair. The security guards shifted their weight, ready to intervene at the slightest provocation. I did not sit. I stood at the head of the conference table, looking down at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. "You have exactly 3 minutes to explain why you are trespassing in my building before I have you arrested for harassment," I stated. "I need help, Victoria," he pleaded, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on the table. "Everything is gone. Everything was taken from me." He did not wait for my permission to continue. The pathetic, miserable story poured out of him in a desperate, rushing waterfall of excuses. The glamorous new life in Singapore had been nothing but a spectacular, disastrous illusion. Chloe, the mistress he had drained my bank account to impress, had methodically bled him dry. Over the course of 9 years, she had convinced him to funnel his massive executive salaries into high-risk overseas crypto ventures registered exclusively in her name. When the overseas markets crashed, Chloe completely vanished. She liquidated every single asset, emptied his offshore accounts, and fled to Europe with a younger investor, leaving Julian holding the bag for astronomical corporate debts. Singapore does not treat financial debt lightly. There is no bankruptcy protection for expatriates. When Julian could not pay his creditors, he was immediately fired from his firm, detained by local authorities, and stripped of his visa. "They deported me, Victoria," Julian whispered, his voice cracking with self-pity. "They seized my apartment, my car, everything. I was put on a plane back to the United States with nothing but the clothes on my back. And it gets worse. Because I had not filed American taxes properly while living abroad, the Internal Revenue Service was waiting for me. I owe the federal government over $300,000 in back taxes and penalties. I am completely bankrupt. I am sleeping on a friend's couch." I listened to this incredible tale of absolute financial ruin, my facial expression remaining completely impassive. He was expecting shock. He was expecting the soft, compliant woman who used to eagerly manage his schedule and praise his accomplishments. He was searching my eyes for a single drop of mercy. He found nothing but a blank, impenetrable wall. "Your 3 minutes are almost up," I noted, checking the clock on the wall. "I still have not heard a single valid reason why you are sitting in my conference room." Julian blinked, clearly taken aback by my freezing reception. "Victoria, please. I am destitute. I have absolutely nothing left. But then I saw your name in a regional business magazine. I saw that you built this massive smart grid company. You are a multi-millionaire now. You have more money than you could ever spend." The realization hit me instantly. He had not come here to apologize for abandoning his medically fragile son. He had not come here to seek redemption. He had searched my name, seen my corporate net worth, and tracked me down looking for a desperate bailout. The audacity was so staggering, it was almost impressive. "And you thought what I asked?" Softly stepping closer to the table. "You thought you could simply walk into my corporate headquarters and I would write a check to the man who stole $52,000 from me while I was bleeding on a hospital bed." He shrank back in his chair, but the desperate greed in his eyes quickly morphed into something much darker and far more calculating. His posture shifted, the pathetic victim routine instantly vanishing as his survival instincts kicked in. "I know I made a mistake," Julian said, lowering his voice into a threatening, smooth cadence. "A terrible mistake. I went to Singapore to figure out who I was. But I am back now. I am an American citizen. And more importantly, I am a father. I have a son, a 9-year-old boy who needs his biological dad in his life." The trap was officially sprung. He was broke. He was cornered. And he was staring at a woman he believed was an easy target sitting on a mountain of cash. He had no idea what was actually waiting for him. Julian leaned forward, attempting to manufacture a look of deep paternal longing. The sudden transition from desperate beggar to righteous, remorseful father was so jarringly rehearsed that it bordered on comedic. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, taking a deep breath to project an aura of newfound stability. "You have to understand where my head was at back then," Julian continued, his voice adopting a practiced, gentle cadence. "I was young. I was terrified. We were facing a mountain of debt, and seeing Ethan in those machines, it completely broke me. I suffered a massive psychological break, Victoria. I panicked. What I did was inexcusable, but it was born out of fear, not malice. I never stopped loving him, not for a single day. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I did not cross my arms. I did not shift my weight. I let his words hang in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the conference room. I let the silence stretch until it became suffocating, forcing him to squirm under my unblinking gaze. "You went to Singapore to find yourself." I repeated his earlier words, stripping them of all emotional inflection. "You found yourself in the arms of your mistress, spending the money that was meant to keep your son breathing. You did not suffer a psychological break, Julian. You made a calculated financial decision to abandon an infant because you preferred luxury over responsibility." Julian flinched, but he quickly recovered, doubling down on the manipulation. "You are holding on to anger, Victoria, and I do not blame you for that. But you are letting your bitterness blind you to what is best for Ethan. A boy needs his father. He needs male guidance. I have spent the last 9 years carrying this immense guilt, waking up every morning wondering what my son looks like, wondering if he likes coding or sports. You cannot punish an innocent child just because you are still mad at me for leaving." It was a classic textbook gaslighting attempt. He was actively trying to rewrite history, painting himself as a tragic, flawed hero who was unjustly separated from his child by a vindictive, bitter ex-wife. He wanted me to feel guilty. He wanted me to believe that by protecting my son, I was actually harming him. He was hoping the wealthy, successful woman standing in front of him still harbored the insecurities of a deserted young mother. "Are you quite finished?" I asked. He paused, clearly thrown off by my absolute lack of emotional reaction. "Victoria, I am pouring my heart out to you. I am humbling myself. I am asking for forgiveness and a chance to be a real family again. We were never a family," I stated, my voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "And you are not humbling yourself. You are performing a severely under-rehearsed monologue because you are broke, facing federal tax evasion charges, and looking for a lucrative meal ticket. You did not wake up every morning wondering about Ethan. You woke up in penthouses spending stolen money until the woman you left us for bled you dry and discarded you." Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He slammed his hand against the table, dropping the gentle father routine entirely. "Do not speak to me like I am one of your employees. I am Ethan's father. I have rights. You kept him from me. You hoarded him while you built this massive corporation, probably using the sympathy card of being a single mother to get ahead. You shut me out." "I did not shut you out," I replied, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper. "You walked out. You stood at the foot of my hospital bed while I was bleeding from surgery and called your son dead weight. You explicitly stated you did not sign up for a life of medical bills. You packed a briefcase and caught a first-class flight. I was young," he shouted, his face turning an angry mottled red. "People make mistakes. You cannot hold that over my head forever. Courts recognize rehabilitation. Judges believe in second chances for fathers who want to be involved. You are not a father," I said, stepping closer to him, closing the physical distance until he was forced to look directly into my eyes. "A father sits in a plastic chair at 4 a.m. listening to a heart monitor keep his child alive. A father works grueling hours, skips meals, and builds an AI algorithm from scratch on a dirty studio apartment floor to pay for pediatric cardiologists. You are merely a donor who fled the scene of the crime. You have contributed absolutely nothing to his existence, his survival, or his current happiness." Julian swallowed hard, the prominent vein in his neck pulsing erratically. He was starting to realize that the scared, weeping girl he remembered was entirely dead. I was a titanium wall, and he was shattering his own fist trying to punch through it. "You cannot keep him from me," Julian said, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. "I know my rights. I will march right into family court. I will tell the judge that I was suffering from undiagnosed trauma and that you weaponized my departure to alienate my son from me. I will demand joint custody. I will demand visitation. You cannot hide him in whatever mansion you bought with this company profits." I looked at him with an expression of profound boredom. He was deploying his final desperate tactic. He was trying to invoke the terror of a custody battle, hoping to trigger the protective, panicking mother instinct. He wanted me to break down, to beg him to stay away, to offer him a financial settlement just to disappear. "You are not going to see Ethan," I said, articulating each word with surgical precision. "You are not going to call him. You are not going to write to him. And you are certainly not going to drag him into a courtroom to play out your pathetic redemption fantasy. Your presence in this building is a security breach, and your presence in this city is an environmental hazard. I turned my back on him and walked toward the conference room door. Your 3 minutes expired a long time ago, Julian. Security will escort you to the sidewalk. If you attempt to re-enter this facility, you will be arrested for trespassing. I placed my hand on the heavy glass handle, ready to end the interaction completely. But Julian was a desperate drowning man, and desperate men do not simply walk away from a potential life raft. He realized the emotional manipulation had failed spectacularly. He realized the guilt trip was completely useless against a woman who had forged her soul in the fires of medical debt and corporate warfare. He had to pivot to the only leverage he believed he had left. He had to pivot to outright extortion. "Wait," Julian barked. The sharp sound of his voice echoed off the thick glass walls. I kept my hand on the heavy stainless steel door handle, pausing without turning around. "You are a very smart woman, Victoria," he continued, the desperate edge in his voice replaced by a sudden greasy confidence. "You built an $85 million company. You know how to calculate risk. You know how to weigh a localized loss against a catastrophic systemic failure." I slowly turned to face him. He had straightened his posture, adjusting the lapels of his cheap gray jacket as if he were preparing to negotiate a major corporate merger. The absolute audacity of the man was breathtaking. "I am listening," I said flatly. "I have been doing some reading," Julian said, pacing slowly across the length of the conference room. "Illinois family courts are incredibly progressive these days. They strongly favor the active involvement of both biological parents in a child life. Joint legal custody is practically the default presumption regardless of the parent's personal history. And when there is a massive glaring disparity in income between the two parents, the courts are very quick to order child support and alimony to ensure the child experiences an equal standard of living in both households." He stopped at the opposite end of the mahogany table, placing his hands on the polished wood and leaning forward. The greedy hunger in his eyes was naked and repulsive. "I did the math, Victoria. Based on your corporate valuation and your probable executive salary, a judge would look at my current unemployed destitute status and award me an absolute fortune. Reverse child support. Spousal maintenance. It would be a massive financial bleeding for you. Get to the point," I demanded. "The point is, a messy public court battle is going to cost you millions in legal fees and corporate public relations damage," Julian smirked. "The media loves a story about a ruthless millionaire female executive using her endless resources to crush a destitute, remorseful father trying to reunite with his only son. Your municipal clients might not appreciate the negative press. Your board of directors might find the scandal extremely distracting." He walked closer, his confidence swelling with every word. He honestly believed he had cornered me. "But I am a reasonable man. I do not want to destroy your company, and I do not necessarily want to disrupt Ethan's life if I do not have to. I am willing to settle this entirely out of court. A private, quiet arrangement." "Define your arrangement," I said, my voice dangerously soft. $50,000 a month, Julian stated, lifting his chin. "Tax-free, directly deposited into an account I control. In exchange for that monthly stipend, I will quietly stay out of your way. I will not file for joint custody. I will not go to the press. I will let you and Ethan continue your perfect, wealthy life without any interruptions from me. You can easily afford $50,000 a month, Victoria. It is a minor business expense to ensure your absolute peace of mind." I stared at him, letting his extortion demand hang in the air. He was attempting to blackmail me using the son he had discarded like trash 9 years ago. "And if I refuse your generous offer to extort me?" I asked. Julian sighed, feigning deep regret. "Then I will be forced to assert my biological rights immediately. I know Ethan attends that elite robotics academy over in the north suburbs. I know exactly what time they let out for the afternoon. It would be a real shame if his biological father had to show up at the school gates to introduce himself in front of all his classmates and teachers. Imagine the psychological trauma that would cause a 9-year-old boy. Imagine the spectacle of the police having to intervene because a wealthy mother is trying to gatekeep a father from his own flesh and blood. My blood turned to absolute ice. The threat was explicit. He was promising to terrorize my child at his school to shatter Ethan's safe, structured world just to force my hand financially. Julian was actively weaponizing a 9-year-old boy's emotional stability to secure a monthly paycheck. "You would traumatize your own son for a paycheck," I stated, making sure his exact intent was voiced aloud and confirmed. "I am simply exercising my legal rights," Julian countered smoothly. "You have until Friday to wire the first $50,000 into my account. I will email you the routing numbers. If the money is not there by noon, I am driving straight to the academy. I will walk right onto that campus, and I will introduce myself to Ethan. Then I will march directly to the family courthouse and file for full joint custody. The choice is entirely yours, Victoria." I did not scream. I did not lunge across the table and wrap my hands around his throat, no matter how intensely every maternal instinct in my body demanded immediate violence. I remained a portrait of absolute chilling composure. He thought he had outmaneuvered me. He thought the threat of public scandal and schoolyard ambushes would force me to open my corporate checkbook. He had no idea that he had just handed me the exact rope I needed to publicly hang him. "You have made your position very clear, Julian," I said, my voice completely devoid of panic or submission. "You have presented a very specific, very detailed demand. I am glad you see reason." He smiled, relaxing his shoulders. I knew the smart, analytical girl I married was still in there somewhere. "We can make this a seamless, highly beneficial transaction for both of us. I am going to leave this room now," I said, turning back to the heavy glass door. "My security team will escort you to the street. Do not speak to my employees. Do not linger in the lobby." Friday at noon, Victoria Julian called out to my back, his voice dripping with arrogant triumph. "Do not make me go to that school." I pulled the door open and stepped out into the hallway where my 2 security guards were waiting with strict military discipline. I did not look back at the pathetic, greedy man sitting in my conference room. I simply nodded to the guards. "Remove him," I ordered. "If he resists, use force." I walked toward the executive elevators, my mind already calculating the precise counteroffensive. Julian thought he had initiated a profitable business negotiation. In reality, he had just triggered a total, devastating war, and I was going to obliterate him entirely. The doors of the executive elevator slid shut, sealing me in a silent, descending steel box. I did not waste a single second processing the emotional shock of seeing my ex-husband. I pulled my phone from my blazer pocket and dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring, his sharp legal mind instantly detecting the urgency in my silence. I told him everything. I relayed Julian's sudden appearance, the deportation from Singapore, the massive federal tax debt, and the explicit threat to ambush Ethan at his private school unless I paid $50,000 a month in extortion money. Marcus did not gasp or offer useless sympathy. I could hear the rapid clicking of his keyboard through the speaker as he immediately began pulling security protocols and drafting emergency court filings. We both knew Julian was desperate, and desperate men are incredibly dangerous when they realize their demands are being ignored. Friday at noon arrived exactly as scheduled. I sat at my desk watching the digital clock on my monitor tick past the deadline. I had not wired a single cent to the account routing number Julian had emailed me. I had not replied to his messages. I simply let the deadline expire in absolute silence. Julian quickly realized I had called his bluff. But instead of marching directly to the school campus that afternoon, he realized he needed leverage. He needed a weapon that could penetrate my corporate armor. He needed the court of public opinion. By Monday morning, Julian had secured legal representation. He did not hire a prestigious corporate litigator. He hired Vance, an aggressive attorney, famous for late-night television commercials and giant billboard advertisements, promising massive settlements. Vance was a man who thrived on creating public spectacles to force wealthy opponents into quiet, lucrative settlements. He took Julian's case on contingency, salivating at the prospect of extracting millions from the chief executive officer of an $85 million tech empire. Vance knew their actual legal foundation was incredibly fragile, so he immediately deployed a different strategy. They launched a highly coordinated, vicious social media smear campaign. The first video dropped on a major local news blog and rapidly spread across social media platforms. It featured Julian sitting on a worn, sagging couch in a dimly lit apartment, looking directly into the camera with perfectly manufactured, tear-filled eyes. He did not look like the arrogant executive who had tossed divorce papers onto a hospital bed. Vance had dressed him to look like a broken, remorseful everyman who just wanted to see his little boy. Julian spun a masterful, entirely fabricated narrative. He told the camera that he had gone overseas 9 years ago to secure a better financial future for his medically fragile son. He claimed his overseas employers had trapped him in a predatory contract, seizing his passport and preventing him from returning home. He painted a picture of a man who had suffered in exile, working tirelessly to get back to American soil, only to return and find his ex-wife transformed into a bitter, power-hungry millionaire. He claimed I was using my vast corporate wealth to illegally gatekeep him from his own flesh and blood, simply because he was currently experiencing financial hardship. The algorithm rewarded the scandal instantly. The video went viral within 48 hours, fueled by targeted advertisements Vance had purchased to ensure maximum local visibility. The headlines were sensationalized and brutal. Millionaire tech executive denies broke father access to son. Heartless CEO uses wealth to erase boy dad. The comment sections across every platform filled with absolute venom, directed squarely at me. Strangers who knew absolutely nothing about the stolen money or the intensive care unit bills I had paid by scrubbing data floors suddenly felt entitled to judge my character. They called me a monster. They called me a cold corporate tyrant who was psychologically damaging a child out of pure spite. The fallout rippled directly into my professional life. My corporate public relations director burst into my office, her face pale, holding a tablet, displaying the latest wave of online vitriol. 2 board members called me within the hour, expressing deep concern about the negative press. Zenith Dynamics relied on maintaining sterling ethical relationships with major municipal networks. City administrators do not like loud, messy tabloid drama surrounding their critical smart grid vendors. The public relations team begged me to release a statement, to draft a press release defending my character, or to arrange a sympathetic television interview to counter Julian narrative. I refused entirely. I sat at my desk and issued a strict company-wide gag order. I would not engage in a public mudslinging contest with a man who had abandoned his child. I would not turn Ethan's private, peaceful life into a highly publicized media circus just to defend my ego against internet trolls. I knew exactly what Vance and Julian were trying to do. They were trying to panic me into a quick settlement to make the bad press disappear. They mistook my tactical, disciplined silence for fear. Marcus stood by my side in my office, monitoring the escalating online situation. Let them talk, Marcus advised, adjusting his suit jacket with a calm, predatory grace. Vance is playing a dangerous game. He is building a public narrative based on the assumption that Julian actually retains legal parental rights. They are getting arrogant. They think your silence means you are scrambling for a defense. We need them arrogant, Victoria. We need them to feel so overly confident that they make a massive, documented legal error. That fatal error was currently being planned in Vance's office. Furious that the viral videos had not resulted in a panicked phone call and a massive settlement check from my legal team, Vance advised his client to escalate the situation physically. The digital smear campaign had laid the necessary groundwork. Now they needed a physical confrontation. They needed footage of the wealthy, heartless mother actively ripping a child away from his weeping, desperate father. Vance told Julian it was time to force the issue in the real world. They decided to bypass the corporate headquarters and go directly for the most vulnerable, highly emotional target available. They were going to ambush my 9-year-old son. Julian mapped out the route to Ethan's exclusive private academy, completely unaware that his impending performance was about to collide with a catastrophic legal reality. Wednesday afternoon at the Robotics Academy was a master class in disciplined routine. The exclusive private school, situated behind wrought iron gates, operated with absolute security. Parents did not simply wander onto the grounds. Access required electronic clearance-registered license plates and a matching photo identification. Julian, driven by the reckless advice of his sleazy attorney, parked his rented sedan 3 blocks away. He and Vance walked toward the campus accompanied by a freelance videographer holding a stabilized smartphone. The plan was incredibly simple. They would wait just outside the primary pedestrian gate, where the older students exited for the private car line. Julian would spot his son rush forward in a display of overwhelming paternal emotion and capture the tearful reunion on camera. When the school security inevitably intervened, Vance would ensure the narrative framed the school as an extension of my malicious wealthy gatekeeping. At exactly 3:15, the heavy oak doors of the main academic building swung open. Students flooded down the stone steps. Julian stood near the brick perimeter wall scanning the crowd. He held a generic store-bought baseball glove in his left hand, a pathetic prop designed purely for the camera. Then he saw him. Ethan was walking slightly apart from the main group of students. He was not laughing or playing tag with the other boys. My 9-year-old son was holding a thick leather-bound notebook, his dark eyes intensely focused on a complex algorithm blueprint he was currently drawing. He walked with a quiet, deliberate confidence, completely absorbed in calculating the processing load capacity of a drone model he planned to build that evening. He wore his blazer unbuttoned, and his backpack hung off one shoulder. He was the absolute center of my universe, and he was walking directly toward a man he had never met. Julian stepped directly into the center of the pedestrian pathway, blocking the exit entirely. The videographer raised the smartphone, framing the shot carefully. Vance nodded eagerly from the sidelines. Julian called out, his voice cracking with a perfectly manufactured theatrical sob. Ethan stopped walking. He did not drop his notebook. He did not gasp. He simply looked up from his drawing, his dark eyes landing on the strange, desperate man blocking his path to the car line. Ethan tilted his head slightly to the left, analyzing Julian with the exact same clinical, chilling detachment I used in the boardroom. "It is me," Julian said, taking a step forward and holding out the baseball glove. "It is your dad. I finally made it back to you, buddy." Ethan blinked twice. He looked at the cheap leather baseball glove, then back up to Julian's face. He did not register fear, and he certainly did not register joy. He registered mild analytical confusion. "I think you have made a logical error," Ethan stated clearly. His voice was precise, entirely devoid of the emotional panic. Julian was desperately trying to provoke, "I do not play baseball. The statistical probability of injury significantly outweighs the strategic value of the sport. Furthermore, you are not my father." Julian froze the manufactured tears, instantly drying up. The camera was still rolling, capturing the bizarre, entirely unscripted interaction. "Ethan, it is me." Julian insisted, his voice losing its soft edge and taking on a tone of frantic urgency. "Your mother hid me from you. She kept me away because she was angry. But I am your biological father. My name is Julian." Ethan adjusted his grip on his notebook. He looked at Julian as if the man were a malfunctioning line of code that needed to be debugged. "My mother does not hide variables," Ethan replied, his tone remaining perfectly even. "She eliminates inefficiencies. And according to my legal guardianship records, which I reviewed when we established my educational trust fund last year, my biological father voluntarily terminated his parental rights exactly 108 months ago. Legally speaking, you do not exist in my family structure. You are a biological donor with zero legal standing. Now please step aside. You are blocking the designated pedestrian transit zone." The silence that fell over the sidewalk was absolutation. The videographer slowly lowered the smartphone, glancing at Vance with a look of pure confusion. Julian stood paralyzed, his mouth hanging slightly open. He had prepared himself for a tearful, emotional boy who longed for a paternal figure. He had prepared for a terrified child who would cling to him. He was completely, utterly unprepared to face a 9-year-old AI prodigy who weaponized legal facts with the exact same ruthless, icy precision as his mother. Julian's shock rapidly morphed into intense, humiliated anger. He realized the camera was capturing his complete rejection by a child who viewed him as nothing more than a minor, annoying obstacle. "You listen to me," Julian hissed, dropping the gentle father routine entirely. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab Ethan by the shoulder. "I am your father, and you are going to show me some respect right now." Ethan did not flinch. He simply took one calculated step backward, maintaining a safe physical perimeter. Before Julian's hand could even brush the fabric of Ethan's blazer, a massive, imposing figure materialized from the crowd of waiting drivers. It was my head of personal security, a former military contractor who had been specifically assigned to monitor Ethan's school drop-offs since the social media smear campaign began. The guard clamped a heavy, unyielding hand around Julian's wrist, stopping his forward momentum instantly. "Do not touch the boy." The guard warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded immediate compliance. Julian tried to yank his arm away, his face turning a mottled, furious red. "Let go of me. I have rights. I am his father. Vance, get this on camera. They are assaulting a parent." Vance stepped forward, pulling legal documents from his briefcase, ready to escalate the confrontation into a full-blown public spectacle. But the spectacle was already over. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled smoothly up to the curb, its tires rolling to a stop just inches from where Vance was standing. The tinted rear window rolled down silently. Marcus leaned out of the vehicle, adjusting his designer sunglasses. He looked at Vance, then at Julian, a cold, ruthless, predatory smile playing across his face. The trap had been perfectly executed, and the desperate, foolish prey had finally walked directly into the center of the crosshairs. Marcus stepped out of the sleek black luxury sedan, buttoning his tailored suit jacket with the commanding elegance of a man who owned the entire city block. Behind him, two marked Chicago police cruisers pulled up sharply to the curb, their lights flashing silently in the crisp afternoon air, casting red and blue reflections across the brick walls. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. As they quickly assessed the tense situation unfolding on the sidewalk, Vance puffed out his chest, waving his generic legal documents like a flimsy shield. He pointed a trembling finger at Marcus. "You cannot interfere with a biological father attempting to make contact with his child," Vance yelled, ensuring the hired videographer was capturing his loud performance. "We are simply exercising his fundamental rights. This is a public sidewalk, and my client has every right to be here." Marcus did not raise his voice. He walked calmly up the stone steps, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the pavement. He completely ignored Vance, walking straight past the flustered attorney to stand directly between Julian and Ethan. The massive security guard released Julian's wrist and stepped back slightly, allowing Marcus to take the absolute lead. "Vance," Marcus said, stating the name like a terminal medical diagnosis. "I reviewed your late-night television commercials yesterday. Unfortunately, cheap courtroom theatrics do not supersede state law. You are currently advising your client to violate a strict active judicial order." Marcus reached into his breast pocket and produced a folded, officially stamped document. He handed it directly to the lead police officer, completely bypassing Vance. "Officer, my name is Marcus. I am the chief legal counsel for Victoria and her son Ethan. You are holding an emergency restraining order signed by a superior court judge exactly 45 minutes ago." The officer unfolded the document, his eyes scanning the judicial signature. "The order explicitly prohibits Julian from coming within 500 feet of Victoria, Ethan, or this academic institution." Marcus stated clearly, his voice carrying incredible authority. "He is currently standing exactly 12 feet from my nephew." Julian's face drained of all color, his manufactured outrage instantly transforming into genuine panic. "A restraining order," Julian stammered, taking a small step backward. "On what grounds? I have not done anything wrong. I just want to see my boy. The grounds are documented. Harassment, severe financial extortion, and a direct written threat to ambush a minor at his educational facility." Marcus replied, turning his dark, piercing gaze to Julian. You sent an email demanding $50,000 a month, explicitly stating that if the extortion money was not paid immediately, you would arrive at this campus to cause severe psychological trauma. You put your blackmail demand in writing, Julian. That is a federal felony. Vance suddenly looked violently ill. His blustering confidence evaporated in a single second. He grabbed Julian's arm, his eyes wide with terror. You sent an extortion email, Vance hissed furiously. You did not tell me you put a financial threat in writing. He also failed to inform you that he voluntarily terminated his parental rights 9 years ago. Marcus added, his voice slicing through Julian's rising hysteria like a scalpel. Which means you, Vance, are currently filming the organized harassment of an unrelated minor child. I strongly suggest you tell your videographer to turn that camera off right now before I file a civil suit against your law firm that will completely bankrupt you before dinner. Vance frantically waved his hands at the cameraman. The red recording light blinked off instantly. Vance took a large, desperate step away from Julian, actively trying to distance himself from his own radioactive client. The lead police officer stepped forward, unbuttoning a pouch on his belt. Sir, I have a valid court-issued restraining order here. You are in direct violation. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. No, please, Julian begged, holding his hands up in total surrender. I did not know she actually got an order. Vance told me public property was legally safe. Officers, hold on a moment, Marcus said smoothly, raising a single authoritative hand. My sister-in-law does not want to press criminal charges today. She does not want her son disrupted by a messy arrest. She simply wants the perimeter secured and the immediate threat removed. Marcus looked at Julian with absolute, unfiltered contempt. You are going to walk away right now. You are going to get into your rented car and you are going to drive back to whatever couch you are currently sleeping on. You will not post on social media. If you violate this order again, I will let the police arrest you, and I will personally ensure the district attorney pursues the maximum sentence for extortion. Marcus turned his back on Julian, dismissing him entirely. He knelt down to eye level with Ethan. The 9-year-old prodigy had not moved a muscle during the exchange. He was simply watching the legal mechanics unfold. Are you ready to go home, Ethan? Marcus asked, his voice softening into genuine familial warmth. Yes, Uncle Marcus, Ethan replied, sliding his notebook safely into his backpack. The structural integrity of this sidewalk is compromised anyway. There are far too many unnecessary variables. Marcus chuckled softly and placed a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder, guiding him toward the waiting luxury sedan. The security guard walked closely behind them, ensuring the perimeter remained completely secure until they were safely inside the armored vehicle. Vance grabbed his briefcase and practically sprinted down the street, abandoning his client completely. Julian stood alone on the sidewalk, surrounded by 4 police officers waiting for him to move. He was utterly humiliated. The grand reunion he planned had turned into a crushing legal defeat. But desperate men are profoundly stupid. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Julian yelled out one final threat. I will demand a formal mediation. She cannot hide behind legal tricks forever. Inside the quiet comfort of the car, Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed Victoria Direct Line. The asset is secure, Marcus reported, looking at Ethan buckled safely into the back seat. And the target took the bait exactly as you predicted. He is demanding a formal mediation. Excellent. Victoria's voice crackled through the car speakers, cold and completely devoid of mercy. Schedule it for Friday. Let him bring his demands. It is time to close the trap. The official notice of mediation was delivered by a private courier to Vance's cramped, poorly lit office the very next morning. The document was printed on heavy cream-colored stationery, bearing the embossed crest of Marcus' prestigious corporate law firm. It was a formal invitation to resolve the pending familial dispute through private binding arbitration. When Julian arrived at the law office an hour later to review the document, he practically vibrated with arrogant, unrestrained triumph. He slammed his hand down on Vance's cluttered desk, knocking over a stack of unpaid utility bills. I told you she would crack. Julian gloated, a massive, greedy smile stretching across his face. She is terrified. That whole stunt with the police and the security guards yesterday was just a desperate bluff. She knows that if we drag this out into a public courtroom, the media will tear her tech company apart. She is begging for a quiet settlement to protect her corporate image. Vance, who had literally run away from the school campus the day before, was suddenly acting like a fearless legal gladiator again. The scent of a massive corporate payout had completely erased his cowardice. He leaned back in his squeaky leather chair and steepled his fingers, nodding in smug agreement. "You played it perfectly, Julian Vance," said, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a contingency fee. "The viral videos did exactly what they were supposed to do. We applied maximum public pressure, and she immediately folded. Offering private mediation this quickly is a massive concession. It is the ultimate white flag. She wants this to disappear before the weekend, which means we hold absolutely all the leverage in that room." They spent the next 4 hours locked in Vance's dingy office, meticulously crafting a list of exorbitant, absolutely delusional demands. Julian paced the stained carpet, treating the mediation strategy like a multi-million-dollar corporate acquisition. He felt entirely vindicated. In his twisted reality, the 9 years he spent ignoring his son with a heart defect were completely irrelevant. He genuinely believed he was owed financial compensation for the stress he endured while being deported from Singapore. First, Julian dictated, holding up a finger, the monthly stipend. "I initially asked for $50,000, but since she decided to play games with restraining orders and police officers, the price just went up. I want $60,000 a month in tax-free reverse child support." That is barely a fraction of her corporate salary. Vance furiously scribbled the number onto his yellow legal pad. "Done. What about housing? You cannot maintain a relationship with a high-net-worth child while sleeping on a friend's couch. A judge would agree that you need suitable accommodations to facilitate joint custody. I want a penthouse," Julian confirmed, his eyes lighting up with unchecked greed. "Nothing too ostentatious, but it needs to be in a premium zip code, $1 million minimum. It must have a security system, a modern kitchen, and a dedicated bedroom for Ethan. She will purchase the property outright and transfer the deed directly into my name to avoid any future leverage." "What about transportation?" Vance prompted, tapping his pen. "A new luxury sport utility vehicle," Julian answered immediately. "Paid in full, and I want guaranteed access to Ethan. Private academy, records, joint legal custody on paper, and the right to 3 weekends a month. I probably will not even use the weekends, but I need the legal custody designation to guarantee the child support checks keep clearing." They continued building their extortion checklist, completely blinded by their own arrogance. They added demands for fully paid health insurance, a clause requiring Victoria to cover all of Vance's exorbitant legal fees, and a strict non-disparagement agreement, preventing Victoria from ever speaking about Singapore. Julian convinced himself that Victoria was a terrified, cornered woman desperate to protect her $85 million empire from bad press. He believed she would sign anything to make him disappear. Across the city, inside her corner office overlooking the freezing Chicago skyline, Victoria was experiencing none of the panic Julian imagined. She sat at her custom desk, sipping black coffee, her pulse steady and calm. Marcus sat in the guest chair reviewing the final preparations for Friday. "He will ask for the moon," Marcus stated, sliding a digital tablet across the desk. "Vance is a bottom feeder, but he knows how to inflate a settlement demand. They are going to walk into my conference room expecting you to hand over the keys to the kingdom." "Let them ask," Victoria replied, her voice smooth and completely unbothered. "Let him list every single delusion he has constructed. I want him to feel as though he has completely cornered me. I want his arrogance to reach its absolute peak before we pull the floor out from under him." "Are the final documents secured?" Marcus asked. "Everything is ready," Victoria confirmed, her dark eyes locking onto the gray water of the lake. "The corporate acquisition was finalized this morning. The paperwork is flawless. There are 0 legal loopholes remaining. Human greed is an incredibly predictable variable." Julian believed he was walking into a lucrative negotiation. He had spent the last week manipulating social media, harassing a 9-year-old boy, and attempting to terrorize a woman he fundamentally underestimated. He thought the mediation was the finish line of a victorious campaign. He had absolutely no idea it was an execution chamber. Victoria closed her laptop and stood up. The stage was set. The legal traps were fully armed. The financial snare was perfectly hidden beneath layers of complex corporate architecture. Friday would not be a negotiation. It would be an absolute slaughter. While Julian spent his Thursday afternoon browsing luxury car catalogs and measuring imaginary drapes for a penthouse, he did not yet own a silent, lethal financial transaction was executing in the background. The modern financial system is a sprawling, interconnected web of liabilities, credit scores, and aggressively traded debt. When a person defaults on their financial obligations, those debts do not simply disappear into a void. They are packaged, bundled, and sold on the secondary market to private collection agencies for pennies on the dollar. Julian had returned from Singapore, leaving a trail of absolute financial wreckage in his wake. His catastrophic downfall overseas was only half the story. When he was deported back to American soil, he attempted to maintain the illusion of his high-rolling expatriate lifestyle. He applied for high-interest credit cards. He took out predatory personal loans from secondary lenders who did not properly verify his overseas employment status. He maxed out every single available line of credit to rent luxury cars and buy expensive dinners, desperately trying to project success until the lenders finally caught on and cut him off completely. Furthermore, the federal government does not forgive tax evasion. The Internal Revenue Service had assessed massive penalties for the years Julian lived in Southeast Asia without properly filing his American tax returns. When federal tax debts remain unpaid for an extended period, the government occasionally outsources the collection of those specific distressed accounts to authorized private debt collection agencies. Between the defaulted credit cards, the predatory personal loans, and the massive federal tax liens, Julian was carrying exactly $300,000 in toxic delinquent debt. He was a walking financial liability, but because he currently possessed absolutely zero assets, his creditors had written him off as uncollectible. They assumed he was a dead end. They were practically begging to offload his portfolio to anyone willing to buy the toxic paper. Marcus knew this. As a top-tier corporate lawyer who specialized in hostile takeovers and asset protection, Marcus understood the predatory mechanics of the secondary debt market better than anyone. He did not just build shields for Victoria. He knew how to forge weapons. On Wednesday morning, 48 hours before the scheduled mediation, Marcus had initiated a highly confidential corporate maneuver. Operating through a fully licensed, heavily obfuscated subsidiary of EM Capital called Zenith Recovery Solutions, Marcus reached out directly to the commercial debt brokers holding Julian delinquent accounts. The negotiation was brutally swift. Debt brokers typically sell uncollectible accounts in massive randomized bundles, making it difficult to purchase a specific individual debt. However, cash is the ultimate leverage in the corporate world. Marcus did not haggle over pennies. He offered a premium upfront cash buyout to acquire the exclusive assigned rights to every single financial obligation Julian currently owed. He purchased the defaulted credit card accounts. He purchased the predatory personal loans. He acquired the outsourced federal tax collection rights. The brokers were absolutely thrilled to liquidate a worthless portfolio. They transferred the titles, the original loan agreements, and the exclusive collection rights directly to Zenith Recovery Solutions. The electronic wire transfer cleared the banking system in less than 2 hours. In the span of a single afternoon, Victoria and Marcus effectively bought Julian's entire financial existence. The legal power this transaction granted them was absolute and terrifying. By purchasing the debt, EM Capital became Julian's sole undisputed primary creditor. They did not just own pieces of paper. They owned the legal authority to financially destroy him at a moment's notice. In the state of Illinois, a primary creditor holding $300,000 in validated delinquent debt possesses staggering legal remedies. They have the immediate right to petition the court for aggressive wage garnishments. They have the authority to execute instantaneous bank levies, meaning the second a single dollar enters any bank account bearing Julian's name, the creditor can legally seize it without warning. Most importantly, they hold the power to place an involuntary lien on any physical property the debtor attempts to acquire. This was the ultimate brilliant irony of Julian extortion plot. Julian was currently sitting in Vance, cheap law office, arrogant and greedy, demanding that Victoria purchase a $1 million penthouse and transfer the deed directly into his name. He demanded a luxury vehicle paid in full. He demanded a $60,000 monthly cash stipend. He had absolutely no idea that the very second Victoria handed him a single asset, the very millisecond a penthouse deed was registered in his name or a dollar hit his checking account, Zenith Recovery Solutions had the legal binding authority to seize it all. If Victoria gave him the penthouse on Friday, Marcus would legally foreclose on it by Monday morning to satisfy the outstanding $300,000 debt. Julian was essentially demanding that Victoria feed him a massive feast, completely unaware that she now owned the stomach it would digest in. On Thursday evening, Marcus walked into Victoria Corner office, holding a sleek black leather binder. He placed it carefully on her custom desk. The binder contained the fully executed debt transfer agreements, the original loan signatures, and the drafted legal motions for immediate asset seizure. "The acquisition is complete," Marcus stated, his voice a low, satisfied rumble. "EM Capital is now the exclusive owner of his entire financial portfolio. He owes us $300,000 payable immediately upon demand." Victoria opened the binder, her dark eyes scanning the official bank stamps and the transferred tax liens. A cold, predatory satisfaction settled deep in her chest. She traced her finger over Julian forged signatures on the defaulted loan applications. "He wants to play the role of a desperate father fighting a wealthy corporation," Victoria said softly, closing the heavy leather binder with a definitive snap. "Let him play his part. Tomorrow we are going to show him what corporate warfare actually looks like." The sun began to set over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the executive office. The trap was not just set. It was armed, locked, and completely inescapable. Friday morning dawned crisp and bitterly cold, mirroring the exact temperature of Victoria resolve. The stage was perfectly arranged for the ultimate execution. Julian was walking into the mediation, expecting a negotiation. He was walking into a financial slaughterhouse. The glass doors of Marcus' downtown law firm slid open precisely at 10. I sat at the far end of the expansive granite conference table, my hands neatly folded over a single unmarked manila folder. Marcus stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, projecting the casual, relaxed authority of a man entirely in control of his environment. He wore a midnight blue suit, his posture impeccably straight, radiating a silent, lethal confidence. Julian and his sleazy attorney Vance strutted into the room exactly 3 minutes late. It was a calculated power play, a pathetic attempt to establish dominance before a single word was spoken. Julian wore a new off-the-rack suit that still held the faint creases of its packaging. He swaggered toward the table with an unearned, arrogant grin, pulling out a chair and dropping heavily into it. Vance flanked him, dropping a thick, disorganized briefcase onto the polished granite with a loud, obnoxious thud. They looked like two scavengers arriving at a feast, completely unaware that they were the main course. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable," Julian said, leaning back and resting his ankle casually on his knee. "I knew you would eventually see the strategic value of keeping this dispute out of the public eye." "My client is ready to resolve this matter today," Vance added, adopting a booming theatrical voice clearly meant to intimidate. "We have prepared a comprehensive settlement agreement that ensures my client receives the equitable treatment he is legally owed as a biological parent. We are operating under the strict assumption that you wish to avoid a protracted, highly publicized custody battle that could severely damage your corporate brand." Marcus walked slowly from the window and took his seat beside me. He did not open a laptop. He did not pull out a legal pad. He simply looked at Vance with an expression of profound, chilling amusement. "Let us dispense with the amateur courtroom monologue," Vance Marcus commanded, his deep baritone instantly lowering the temperature in the room. "You requested this mediation to present your terms. The clock is ticking. Present them." Vance bristled at this dismissal, but quickly opened his briefcase, pulling out a stapled packet of paper. He slid it across the smooth granite toward Marcus. My client is a devoted father who suffered extreme financial and emotional hardship while trapped overseas. He is now seeking to establish a stable, permanent presence in his son's life. However, a child accustomed to a multi-million-dollar lifestyle cannot be expected to visit his father in substandard living conditions. The court requires a parity of lifestyle to ensure the child does not experience psychological whiplash between households. Julian nodded solemnly, attempting to manufacture an expression of deep paternal concern. "A boy needs his biological father, Victoria," he said, staring directly into my eyes. "Ethan needs a male role model to guide him. I cannot provide that guidance if I am struggling to survive while you hoard a massive fortune. It is incredibly damaging to a child to see his father treated like a second-class citizen. I am asking for the bare minimum required to build a proper home for our son." I kept my facial expression completely blank. I did not blink. I did not betray a single ounce of the absolute disgust boiling in my veins. I simply waited for him to list the price tag he had placed on his non-existent relationship with my son. To ensure this parity of lifestyle, Vance declared, reading loudly from his printed document, "We are demanding the immediate purchase of a residential property in a premium school district. The property value must be no less than $1 million. The deed will be transferred exclusively into my client name to prevent any future financial leverage or manipulative gatekeeping from your side." Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, "And I will need reliable transportation to drive Ethan to his extracurricular activities. A new luxury sport utility vehicle, fully paid off, registered in my name. I think that is a very reasonable request for a safe family vehicle." Marcus did not write any of this down. He simply gestured with his hand for them to continue. Furthermore, Vance announced, his voice swelling with greedy anticipation to maintain the household and provide for the child's daily needs. "During visitation, we are requiring a mandatory tax-free monthly stipend of $60,000. This reverse child support and spousal maintenance will be deposited directly into my client account on the 1st of every month. In exchange for these financial concessions, my client is willing to waive his right to a public trial and will settle for joint legal custody on paper, with a highly flexible physical visitation schedule." Julian smiled a wide, predatory grin that exposed his absolute lack of morality. "It is a win for everyone, Victoria. You get to protect your precious $85 million tech company from a nasty media scandal. I get the resources I need to be the father Ethan deserves. We sign the papers today, the money transfers by Monday, and I cancel the press conference I have scheduled for next week." The silence that followed his extortion demand was heavy and absolute. Julian and Vance sat back, visibly radiating triumph. They honestly believed they had executed a flawless legal ambush. They had laid out their exorbitant, delusional demands, fully expecting me to panic argue or attempt to negotiate the numbers down. They thought my silence was the paralyzing shock of a defeated woman. I looked at the stapled packet of demands resting on the granite table. Then I looked up at Julian. "Are these your final non-negotiable terms?" I asked. My voice was eerily calm, completely devoid of the panic he was so desperately searching for. Julian exchanged a quick, arrogant glance with his sleazy attorney. "Absolutely," Julian confirmed, puffing out his chest. "Not a single dollar less. You sign over the penthouse, the car, and the monthly $60,000, or I walk right out of this office and drag you through the muddiest, most destructive public custody battle this city has ever seen." I turned my head slowly to look at Marcus. Marcus met my gaze, a cold, ruthless glint illuminating his dark eyes. The trap had been fully articulated. The extortion was officially on the record. The enemy had marched directly to the center of the execution block and proudly demanded the drop of the blade. "I think we have heard enough," I said, turning my attention back to the arrogant man sitting across from me. "Marcus, please show my former husband exactly what his demands are actually worth." Marcus leaned forward, his movements remarkably precise and deliberate. He did not bother reaching for a thick, disorganized briefcase like Vance. He simply picked up the single thin manila folder resting quietly in front of me on the granite table. He opened it, withdrawing a crisp piece of paper. He slid it precisely to the center of the granite table, stopping it equidistant between Vance and the increasingly arrogant Julian. "Read it carefully," Mr. Vance Marcus instructed, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "Read every single clause before you dare to speak another word in my conference room." Vance scoffed, adjusting his cheap tie. He picked up the paper with a dramatic sigh, preparing to launch into another rehearsed monologue. However, the moment his eyes scanned the bold legal heading at the top of the page, his mouth snapped shut. His eyes darted across the text with frantic speed. The smug grin vanished, replaced by pure panic. "What is it?" Julian asked. "Vance, what did they give you?" Vance did not answer, completely paralyzed by the digital signature and judicial stamp. He flipped the document over, searching for a loophole to save his contingency fee. He found nothing. "Mr. Vance appears to have lost his voice," Marcus stated. "Allow me to summarize. That document is a voluntary termination of parental rights. You executed it 9 years ago at O'Hare Airport in exchange for absolute immunity regarding the $52,000 you stole while my sister-in-law was recovering from open-heart surgery." Julian blinked, the color rapidly draining from his shocked face. "What exactly are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking. "I was under extreme duress. That paper means absolutely nothing. A judge will toss it out the second I explain. She forced me." Marcus laughed. "You underestimate my legal competence. You signed a binding, irrevocable termination that was ratified and permanently sealed by a family court judge. I filed the supporting affidavit myself, including your explicit refusal to care for a medically fragile infant with a heart defect. The judge permanently severed your parental rights to protect that child." Vance finally dropped the document onto the table as if it were coated in acid. "You did not tell me about this," Vance hissed at his client, trembling with furious indignation. "You sat in my office and swore you were a devoted father who was unlawfully alienated by a wealthy ex-wife. You never mentioned signing a voluntary termination." "Because it does not matter," Julian shouted abruptly, standing up and pointing a shaking finger directly at Marcus. "I am his biological father. Basic DNA proves it. You cannot just erase a father from existence with a legal technicality. I have fundamental constitutional rights to my child." "You have absolutely zero rights," Marcus corrected, his voice slicing through Julian rising hysteria. "In Illinois, a finalized voluntary termination of parental rights is permanent and entirely irrevocable. You severed the legal tie to avoid financial liability and criminal fraud charges. From a legal standpoint, you are a complete stranger to Ethan. You have the exact same parental rights as a random pedestrian walking down the street outside this building. You cannot file for joint custody. You cannot file for visitation. You cannot demand access to his educational records. You are legally a ghost." Julian stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his leather chair. He looked at Vance, silently pleading for his attorney to find a way out of the trap. Vance simply shook his head rapidly, packing his disorganized papers back into his briefcase. Vance knew a dead end when he saw one. He knew he could not extort a millionaire using a client who possessed zero legal standing. But the child support, Julian stammered, eyes wide with desperate realization. The parity of lifestyle. The court demands that a child receive support from both parents. Marcus folded his hands on the table, delivering the final legal blow. Child support is an obligation tied directly to legal parentage. Because you are not a legal parent, you cannot demand reverse child support. You cannot demand alimony. You cannot demand a $1 million penthouse, a luxury vehicle, or a $60,000 monthly stipend. Your entire extortion plot was built on the fundamental assumption that you possessed leverage. You possess absolutely nothing. I will go directly to the press. Julian threatened, his voice cracking sharply as his carefully constructed house of cards collapsed entirely around him. I will tell the news networks. You manipulated a terrified, grieving father into signing away his rights. I will ruin your pristine corporate image permanently. You are welcome to try. I finally spoke, my voice cold and steady. I watched him squirm, relishing the destruction of his confidence. But if you take this to the press, Marcus will legally unseal the affidavit. We will release the bank records, showing exactly how you stole the medical funds intended for a premature baby in the intensive care unit. We will publish the emails where you called your own child a dead weight. The public will not see a tragic, alienated father. They will see a cowardly thief who abandoned his family and returned 9 years later demanding a massive payout. Julian slowly sank back into his leather chair, completely and utterly defeated. The aggressive, greedy swagger was gone, instantly replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man who realized he had just blindly walked into a corporate firing squad. He truly had absolutely no leverage whatsoever. He had absolutely no legal standing remaining. He certainly had no son. But the execution was not over. The legal drop was merely the first phase of our counter-offensive. Julian thought leaving empty-handed was the absolute worst-case scenario. He was about to learn that he was not walking away with nothing. He was walking away with a crushing, inescapable financial catastrophe. I quietly looked over at Marcus, instantly signaling for the second, far more devastating trap to be sprung. Marcus smoothly withdrew his hand from the thin manila folder containing the voluntary termination document. He reached beneath the polished granite table and retrieved the heavy black leather binder. He dropped it onto the surface with a massive echoing thud that made Julian physically jump in his seat. The sound was the unmistakable gavel strike of absolute corporate execution. Julian was already shaking. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as his extortion plot disintegrated. He thought he was simply leaving this mediation empty-handed. He honestly believed that walking away with $0 was the absolute worst-case scenario. He had no idea he was currently operating in the extreme negative thesis. You came here today demanding a $1 million penthouse, a luxury car, and $60,000 a month, I said, standing up slowly from my chair. I buttoned my suit jacket, projecting total dominance over the room. You calculated your entire extortion strategy based on the arrogant assumption that you were a legally recognized father with leverage. I began pacing slowly down the length of the conference room, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. But since we have already firmly established that you are legally a ghost to my son, let us talk about who you actually are in the eyes of the law. Julian, you are an unemployed, deported expatriate, carrying exactly $300,000 in highly toxic delinquent debt. Julian's eyes snapped toward me wide with sudden primal fear. Vance stopped packing his briefcase, his sleazy legal mind desperately trying to comprehend how I knew the exact dollar amount of his client's confidential financial ruin. Marcus opened the heavy leather binder, flipping to the first index tab. $80,000 in defaulted high-interest credit cards. Marcus listed, his deep voice reciting the numbers like a funeral dirge. $70,000 in predatory personal loans secured through secondary lenders immediately after your prompt deportation from Singapore, and $150,000 in federal tax liens resulting from years of unfiled expatriate returns. That has absolutely nothing to do with you, Julian stammered, his voice rising in panic. My personal finances are none of your business. I will declare bankruptcy. You cannot touch me. You cannot declare bankruptcy on federal tax liens. Julian I smiled, looking down at him with profound pity. And you certainly cannot hide from a primary creditor who holds the exclusive assigned rights to every single financial obligation you possess. Marcus turned a page in the binder, revealing a stack of documents stamped with official red ink. When a debtor defaults, their liabilities do not magically disappear. They are bundled and sold on the secondary market for pennies on the dollar. Usually, these toxic bundles are purchased by massive, faceless debt collection agencies operating out of cheap call centers. On Wednesday morning, Marcus continued tracing a line on the document with his gold pen. A fully licensed debt collection agency approached your specific creditors. We bypassed the typical randomized bundle purchasing process. We offered a premium upfront cash buyout to acquire the exclusive assigned rights to your exact portfolio. We bought the defaulted credit cards. We bought the predatory loans. We acquired the outsourced federal tax collection rights. Julian looked physically sick. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "Who is we?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What agency?" "The agency is called Zenith Recovery Solutions," I stated, stopping directly behind his leather chair. "It is a fully owned, heavily obfuscated subsidiary of my corporate empire. Zenith Recovery Solutions operates under the umbrella of a private blind trust. The corporate entity is registered under the name EM Capital S. As of Wednesday afternoon, EM Capital legally purchased every single debt you owe." Julian stared at the documents in the binder. He recognized his own forged signatures on the defaulted loan applications. He saw the federal transfer stamps transferring his tax debt. "We did not just buy pieces of paper," I whispered, leaning down slightly so my voice was right next to his ear. "We bought your entire financial existence." "What does that mean?" Julian choked out, shrinking away from me. Marcus leaned forward, interlacing his fingers on the granite table, thoroughly relishing the moment. "It means EM Capital is your sole, undisputed primary creditor. We own the legal authority to financially destroy you at a moment's notice. In the state of Illinois, a primary creditor holding $300,000 in validated delinquent debt possesses staggering legal remedies." I walked around the table and returned to my seat, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "We have the immediate right to petition the court for aggressive wage garnishments. If you manage to secure a minimum wage job, we will legally seize your paycheck before you can even buy groceries. We have the authority to execute instantaneous bank levies. If a single dollar enters any bank account bearing your name, we will freeze the account and extract the funds immediately. And most importantly," Marcus added, delivering the killing blow, "we hold the absolute power to place an involuntary lien on any physical property you attempt to acquire." Julian stopped breathing. The blood completely drained from his face as the realization hit him. "You came into this room today," I said softly, "demanding that I purchase a $1 million penthouse and transfer the deed directly into your name. Did you honestly think I would refuse? I was actually hoping you would sign a binding settlement agreement today, because the very millisecond a house deed was registered in your name, Zenith Recovery Solutions had the legal authority to seize it to satisfy your outstanding debt. If I handed you the keys to a penthouse today, Marcus would legally foreclose on it by Monday morning." Vance practically threw his remaining papers into his briefcase. He wanted absolutely no part of this corporate slaughter. He was a cheap hustler, and he had just walked into a room with financial titans. "But who is EM Capital?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You cannot just hide behind a shell company to torture me. I will sue you for harassment. I will sue the trust." "You cannot sue a blind trust," Marcus stated calmly. "And you certainly cannot sue the beneficiary." "Who is the beneficiary?" Julian yelled, looking wildly between me and Marcus, who actually owns the holding company. I sat perfectly still, letting the silence build until the tension in the room was unbearable. I looked at Julian with eyes as cold as the freezing lake outside the window. "EM stands for Ethan and Marcus," I said, my voice slicing through the room with absolute merciless precision. "Marcus is the sole legal executive and the sole exclusive beneficiary of every single asset, every piece of real estate, and every collected commercial debt package inside that holding company is my 9-year-old son." The realization hit Julian like a physical blow to the chest. He collapsed back into his chair, his jaw dropping open in silent, absolute horror. "You called him a dead weight," I said every word, dripping with lethal satisfaction. "You threw away your parental rights because you did not want the financial liability of an infant with a heart defect. Now, 9 years later, you are standing in my city, completely bankrupt. You do not have a son, Julian. You have a creditor. Your 9-year-old child is your sole legal master. You owe him $300,000 payable immediately upon demand." The silence in the conference room was absolute, heavy enough to crush bone. Julian stared at me, his eyes wide and unblinking, his chest rising and falling in erratic panic jerks. His brain struggled to process the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He had marched into this building expecting to weaponize my child against me. Instead, he had just learned that his entire existence was legally owned by a 9-year-old boy he had discarded in a hospital room. He turned his head slowly, looking at Vance. His sleazy attorney was already standing, clutching his disorganized briefcase to his chest like a life preserver. Vance did not look at his client. He looked at Marcus, terrified of the corporate shark sitting calmly across the granite table. "You cannot leave me here," Julian croaked, his voice raw and pathetic. "Vance, do something. File an injunction. Claim this is a conflict of interest." "I am formally withdrawing as your legal counsel," Vance stated, his voice trembling as he backed toward the heavy glass door. "You lied to me about your parental standing. You withheld the existence of a voluntary termination document. You exposed my firm to a massive civil liability suit from Zenith Recovery Solutions. We have absolutely no attorney-client privilege left. Do not call my office. Do not step foot near my practice." Vance reached blindly behind him, pushed the glass door open, and practically sprinted down the carpeted hallway. He did not look back. Julian was entirely alone. "You cannot do this," Julian whispered, turning back to face me. The arrogance was completely eradicated, leaving behind a terrified, hollowed-out shell of a man. "You cannot just buy a person life." "We did not buy your life." Marcus corrected, opening another folder from the black leather binder. "You surrendered it the moment you defaulted on your obligations. We simply acquired the legal right to collect, and since you explicitly demanded a prompt resolution today, EM Capital has decided to initiate the immediate collection process." Julian flinched. "What does that mean?" "Does that it means the grace period is over?" I said, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the cool granite. "Did you honestly think we would wait for you to leave this building before we started executing the liens?" Marcus slid a freshly printed document across the table. It was a court-ordered writ of execution signed and stamped by a federal judge just 2 hours prior. While you were busy outlining your ridiculous demands for a luxury vehicle and a $1 million penthouse, Marcus explained my legal team was filing an emergency motion for asset seizure. "We located the bank account you opened when you arrived back in the United States, the one you used to secure the deposit on your rental sedan, parked 3 blocks away." Julian gasped, patting his jacket pockets frantically, as if checking for his wallet. "As of 20 minutes ago," Marcus continued, his voice ringing with mechanical precision, "that bank account has been fully levied. The remaining balance of $412 has been frozen and seized to satisfy a fraction of the interest on your debt. Furthermore, we have contacted the rental car agency. Since your payment method is now officially frozen, your rental contract has been instantly voided. The agency is currently towing the sedan back to their lot." "You took my car!" Julian yelled, panic finally giving way to sheer terror. "How am I supposed to leave? How am I supposed to get back to the apartment?" "You are going to walk," I replied. "Please, Victoria." Julian begged. He dropped out of his leather chair and literally fell to his knees on the hardwood floor. He clasped his hands together, staring up at me with tears streaming down his face. "You have made your point. You won. You completely humiliated me. But you cannot leave me with absolutely nothing. I have no money. I have no car. I cannot even buy food today. Please just forgive the debt. You have millions. You do not need my money." I stood up and walked slowly around the granite table, looking down at the man kneeling on the floor. "I do not need your money," I agreed, my voice deadly calm. "But Ethan does." "He is a child," Julian cried, reaching out toward the hem of my skirt. "He does not even know what a debt collection agency is." I took a sharp step backward, ensuring he could not touch me. "He does not need to know right now," I said. "All he needs to know is that his future is entirely secure. You stole $52,000 from his medical fund when he was fighting to breathe in an incubator. You left us to drown in hospital debt. Every single dollar you owe EM Capital will be collected. Every time you get a job, my company will garnish your wages. Every time you try to rent a nice apartment, my company will flag your credit report. Every time you try to build a new life, your son will own the very foundation you try to build it on. You are a monster." Julian sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "You are a cold, heartless monster." "I am a mother," I corrected softly. "And I am exactly the kind of mother you forced me to become." I looked at Marcus, who was already signaling for the security team waiting outside the conference room. Two broad-shouldered guards immediately stepped through the glass doors. "The mediation is officially concluded," I announced, turning my back on Julian. "Security will escort you out of the building. If you attempt to resist, they will call the police, and you will be arrested for trespassing and violating an active restraining order." "Victoria, please," Julian wailed as the guards hoisted him off the hardwood floor by his arms. "You cannot do this. I am his father." The guards dragged him backward toward the hallway. He kicked his feet, struggling helplessly against their iron grips, but he was completely overpowered. His pathetic cries echoed off the thick glass walls, growing fainter as they pulled him toward the executive elevators. I watched through the glass as the guards forced him into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off his final desperate plea. The silence that rushed back into the conference room was beautiful. It was the sound of total, undeniable victory. Marcus picked up the heavy black leather binder and placed it carefully back into his briefcase. He snapped the latches shut. The sound was sharp and definitive. "The asset seizure is active across all databases," Marcus reported, adjusting his suit jacket. "By the time he reaches the street, his financial identity will be completely locked down. He cannot open a new line of credit. He cannot secure a standard lease. He will have to survive entirely on cash, operating completely outside the modern financial system." I nodded, keeping my eyes fixed on the street below. A few minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the lobby opened. The security guards pushed Julian out onto the freezing, windswept pavement. He stumbled barely, keeping his balance. He patted his pockets, completely stranded. He looked around the bustling city street, a man entirely erased from the world of power and privilege he so desperately craved. He had nothing. He was nothing. And he owed every single ounce of his nothingness to the son he had discarded. "Let us go home," I said, turning away from the window. "We have an AI drone to build." Marcus nodded silently, picking up his briefcase. The heavy wooden door of the conference room closed behind us, sealing away the phantom energy of the man we had just financially eradicated. We walked side by side down the long carpeted corridor toward the executive elevators. The air up here on the top floor was always perfectly climate-controlled. Yet I felt a distinct, refreshing warmth radiating through my veins. The heavy invisible armor I had worn for 9 grueling years was finally beginning to unbuckle. The brushed steel doors of the elevator slid open. We stepped inside and I pressed the button for the main lobby. The descent was rapid and smooth. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal doors. The woman staring back at me possessed a sharp, uncompromising clarity. She was not the bleeding, terrified 20-something girl abandoned in a hospital recovery ward. She was a corporate titan who had just executed a flawless, devastatingly precise defensive maneuver to protect her empire and her child. The elevator chimed and the doors glided open to reveal the sprawling, multi-story marble lobby of the Zenith Dynamics headquarters. The space was a monument to modern corporate architecture, flooded with natural light and echoing with the efficient hum of professionals moving about their day. However, the typical rhythm of the lobby had ground to a sudden chaotic halt, directly in the center of the expansive marble floor near the primary security checkpoint. Julian was actively resisting the 2 broad-shouldered guards who had escorted him down. He was twisting and thrashing his cheap gray suit jacket, slipping off his shoulders. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. Through the massive glass revolving doors at the front entrance, I could see Vance. The sleazy attorney was practically sprinting down the icy Chicago pavement, violently waving his briefcase in the air to flag down a passing taxi. Vance threw himself into the back seat of a yellow cab, slamming the door shut and speeding away, permanently abandoning his ruined client to the wolves. Julian watched the cab disappear into the city traffic, the last ounce of his false confidence evaporating into the freezing air. He realized he was entirely isolated. He turned his head frantically, his wild eyes scanning the lobby until they locked directly onto me as I stepped out of the elevator. "Victoria!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking horribly as it echoed off the marble walls. Dozens of my employees visiting municipal administrators and corporate executives stopped exactly where they were standing. The entire lobby fell into a stunned, breathless silence, watching the chaotic spectacle unfold. With a sudden violent jerk, Julian managed to tear his arm away from one of the security guards. He did not run toward the exit. He ran directly toward me. The guards lunged after him, but he threw himself forward, sliding heavily across the polished marble floor until he crashed right at my feet. He dropped squarely onto his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored trousers. I took a swift, calculated step backward, ensuring his grasping fingers met nothing but empty air. "Please," Julian begged, staring up at me from the cold floor. Tears and sweat mingled on his flushed, desperate face. "You cannot let them throw me out into the street. I have absolutely nothing. I do not have a single dollar to my name. My rental car is gone. My accounts are completely frozen. You own my entire life. Please, Victoria, I am begging you. Just give me enough to get a bus ticket out of the state. Just give me a fraction of a percent of what you have." The security guards rushed forward, reaching down to haul him back to his feet. "Wait," I commanded, raising a single hand. The guards froze instantly, stepping back, but keeping their stances wide and ready. Marcus stood silently at my shoulder, an immovable sentinel watching the final act of this execution. The entire lobby held its collective breath. Everyone was watching the powerful CEO deal with a weeping, pathetic trespasser kneeling at her feet. I looked down at Julian. I did not feel a single twinge of pity. I did not feel the slightest echo of the love I had once held for the man I married. I felt absolutely nothing. The space inside my chest where my heart used to break for him was completely hollowed out, replaced by solid, unyielding titanium. "You are asking me for mercy," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the vast, silent lobby. "You are begging for a financial handout from the exact same woman you left to drown in over $100,000 of medical debt. You are asking for compassion from the mother of the child you explicitly called a dead weight." "I was wrong," Julian sobbed, his chest heaving as he stared up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "I was stupid and young and terrified. But I am still a human being. You cannot just erase me from existence. You cannot just leave me to starve. You erased yourself 9 years ago," I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "You signed a legal document severing your ties to my family because you wanted to enjoy the luxury of Singapore without the inconvenience of a sick infant. You made a calculated, greedy choice. Now the mathematics of your choices have simply balanced out." "Victoria, I am on my knees," he wailed, burying his face in his hands. "And my son was having open heart surgery," I replied, cutting through his manufactured grief with razor-sharp precision. "I spent years working, grueling hours, skipping meals, and sacrificing every ounce of my youth to ensure my child survived the wreckage you left behind. I built an empire from the $12 you left in our bank account. You do not get to return a decade later, demand a piece of the fortress you refuse to help build, and then cry when you are crushed by the gates." I signaled to the guards with a sharp nod. "Get him out of my building. If he causes any further disruption, have the local precinct arrest him for criminal trespassing." The guards did not hesitate. They grabbed Julian by the arms, hauling him forcefully off the marble floor. He did not fight back this time. The absolute freezing finality in my voice had broken whatever fight he had left in him. His legs went limp, and the guards practically dragged his dead weight toward the revolving glass doors. He did not shout my name again. He simply wept a hollow, pathetic sound that faded as the heavy doors pushed him out into the bitter winter wind. I turned my back on the entrance, entirely dismissing the sight of him stumbling onto the icy pavement. I looked around the lobby. The employees and visitors were staring at me with a mixture of absolute awe and profound respect. They had just witnessed a masterclass in corporate and personal boundaries. I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal jacket, holding my head high. I walked toward the private underground parking garage, Marcus matching my confident stride. The air outside was freezing, but the future waiting for me was impossibly bright. I had a massive company to run, a brilliant sun to raise, and an AI drone to build. The past was finally completely dead. The echoing click of my heels against the polished concrete of the private underground parking garage was the only sound accompanying us. The frigid air of the lower level bit at my cheeks, but the pristine armored domestic sport utility vehicle waiting in my reserved spot represented absolute safety. Marcus unlocked the doors with a swift press of his key fob. We climbed inside the heavy doors, shutting with a vault-like thud that instantly sealed out the noise of the city above. Marcus started the engine, the powerful motor humming to life. He did not immediately shift the vehicle into drive. Instead, he took a deep breath, resting his hands on the leather steering wheel, and turned to look at me. The ruthless, predatory corporate lawyer who had just systematically dismantled a man in a glass conference room was entirely gone. In his place sat the warm, fiercely protective man who had paid my rent when I was a terrified young mother. "You did it, Victoria," Marcus said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "You completely excised the infection. He will never ever cast a shadow over this family again." I leaned my head back against the leather headrest, closing my eyes for just a fraction of a second. I did not do it alone. I replied, looking over at the man who had been more of a father to my son than Julian could ever comprehend. "We did it." Marcus smiled, shifting the vehicle into gear, and we drove up the concrete ramp, merging seamlessly into the chaotic flow of the Chicago afternoon traffic. The ride to the suburbs was peaceful. I watched the gray, frozen cityscape blur past my tinted window, feeling the last remaining ounces of toxic adrenaline flush out of my system. The absolute finality of the confrontation had left me feeling remarkably light. 35 minutes later, the heavy iron gates of my property swung open automatically, recognizing the encrypted signal from the vehicle. We pulled up the long, curving driveway flanked by towering evergreen trees that shielded the property from the outside world. Before Marcus even cut the engine, the heavy oak front door of my house pushed open. Maya stood on the porch wrapped in a thick knit cardigan, the porch lights casting a warm, golden glow against the encroaching winter dusk. She did not wait for me to walk up the steps. She hurried down the stone path, wrapping her arms around me the second my feet hit the driveway. "Is it over?" Maya asked, pulling back to search my face, her eyes shining with protective anxiety. "It is completely over," I confirmed, squeezing her hands. "He is a ghost. He has absolutely no money, no leverage, and no legal standing. The holding company owns his debt, and he has been permanently evicted from our reality." Maya let out a massive, shaky sigh of relief, pulling me into another fierce embrace. "I am so incredibly proud of you," she whispered into my shoulder. We walked inside the house together, peeling off our winter coats. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh herbs. The home was impeccably clean, warm, and vibrating with an energy of total security. I walked past the kitchen and turned toward the sunken living room. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the thick plush rug. Surrounding him was a sprawling, highly complex array of motorized components, interlocking gears, and miniature hydraulic pumps. He held a small tablet in his left hand, running lines of diagnostic code, while his right hand carefully adjusted the tension on a suspended drone propeller. He was entirely in his element, a brilliant mind orchestrating order out of chaos. I stood in the doorway, simply watching him. This was the child Julian had called dead weight. This was the boy who was supposed to ruin my life, tie me down, and drain my resources. Instead, he was the absolute architect of my survival. He was the reason I had fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal to build an empire. Ethan looked up, his dark eyes immediately locking onto mine. He set the tablet down and scrambled to his feet. "Mom," he announced, his face breaking into a bright, genuine smile. "I recalibrated the weight distribution algorithm for the primary rotors. The drone can now sustain 30% more kinetic force without compromising the flight path." "That is incredible, sweetheart," I said, dropping to my knees right there on the edge of the rug, completely disregarding my expensive tailored suit. I opened my arms and he rushed into them, wrapping his arms around my neck. I held him tightly, burying my face in his dark hair, breathing in the scent of childhood innocence and safety. He was solid, healthy, and perfectly secure. Marcus walked into the living room, rolling up the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt and loosening his tie. Move over. Aerospace engineer Marcus joked, dropping down onto the rug next to the drone model. Let your uncle see if you calculated the wind shear resistance correctly. I bet I can find a vulnerability in your code. Ethan laughed, a bright, joyous sound that filled the entire house. You can try, Uncle Marcus, but my mathematics are flawless. I sat back on my heels, watching the two of them instantly dive into the complex robotics project. Maya walked in from the kitchen, handing me a glass of red wine, and sat on the sofa behind us. I looked at the three of them, the brilliant boy, the fiercely protective sister, and the brilliant lawyer who had stood between us and total ruin. This was my family. Blood creates relatives, but loyalty, sacrifice, and showing up in the darkest, most terrifying moments of life create a family. Julian had relied on a biological technicality to demand a multi-million-dollar payout. He had fundamentally misunderstood the currency of our household. We did not trade in genetics. We traded in unyielding absolute devotion. I had spent my 20s running from the shadow of medical debt and the trauma of abandonment. I had built an $85 million corporate fortress to ensure my child would never feel the cold sting of poverty. But sitting on the floor of my living room watching Ethan explain variable load dynamics to the man who actually acted like his father, I realized the empire was not the money. The empire was this exact moment, the peace, the safety, the undeniable reality that we had won. Sometimes the most devastating insults are the exact blueprints you need to build your kingdom. They call you a burden. They call you worthless. They leave you bleeding and broke, expecting you to quietly fade away into the statistics of failure, but they drastically underestimate the terrifying, unstoppable force of a person who has absolutely nothing left to lose. You take their cruelty, you synthesize it into pure ambition, and you build a reality so massive and untouchable that it legally crushes them the second they try to return. Have you ever taken the worst betrayal of your life and weaponized it into your greatest success? Have you ever had to build a chosen family when the one you trusted walked away? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. If you found power in this journey, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded that rock bottom is just the foundation for a skyscraper. Never apologize for protecting your peace, and never ever negotiate with a ghost. The story of Victoria rise from absolute devastation to unimaginable success offers a profound lesson on resilience. The most painful betrayals can serve as the strongest foundation for our greatest triumphs. When faced with the ultimate abandonment, left physically vulnerable, financially ruined, and holding a fragile newborn with a heart defect, it would have been easy to succumb to despair. Instead, Victoria transformed that agonizing cruelty into high-octane fuel to survive. This narrative teaches us that our absolute lowest moments do not define our capacity for future success. In fact, hitting rock bottom strips away illusions and leaves us with clarity. Victoria did not waste her precious energy seeking revenge in the immediate aftermath. She focused entirely on survival, grinding through sleepless nights to build a secure fortress for her son. Her eventual victory over her ex-husband was not born of petty vindictiveness, but of cold, calculated preparation and the unyielding protection of her new empire. Furthermore, the story beautifully illustrates that we are not bound by the family we lose, but empowered by the family we intentionally choose to build. Her exceptional brother-in-law and sister stood in the gap where her husband failed, proving that genuine loyalty is forged through actions, not mere obligations. The betrayal she suffered forced her to establish ironclad boundaries, ensuring her peace was never compromised again. Ultimately, the severe trauma that was meant to break her became the exact blueprint she used to build an untouchable kingdom. We all face moments where we feel discarded, abandoned, or underestimated. The ultimate choice is whether we let that destruction bury us, or if we use those very bricks to build something undeniably spectacular and lasting forever. Transform your deepest pain into your greatest power and begin actively constructing your own untouchable fortress.